Alright, so we're going to be starting with 19th century now. So, looking at your board notes, the first thing we see on there is 18 to 1850 Romanticism flourishes, starting in Germany and spreading throughout Europe. Okay, what you need to understand right now is that the 1800s were just rife with revolution and demand for all sorts of reforms, and mainly because of the Napoleonic Wars. Now, Napoleon conquered most of Europe, and all the wars that took to do that severely depleted all of Europe's resources. So they're economically depressed. It was during this particular point in time also that industrialization started to pick up. Industrialization itself causes sort of urbanization, wherein people from the outlying who used to work farms now start coming into the cities to work. The cities now are not ready for that many people to come into work, so they become overcrowded. Living conditions are horrible. So it's really sort of a depressive, horrendous socioeconomic state at this point in time throughout all of Europe. And there were various uprisings that occurred, but they weren't really successful until around 1848 to 1849. And out of all of this sort of depression grew a new style of theater, and it was Romanticism. And it's kind of I like to typify it as sort of like looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, you know, seeing what it should be as opposed to the hell that it is. And this style actually started in Germany. There were seeds of it elsewhere, but Germany is where we really picked it up. So looking at Germany and Austria here, you see it on the list, 1810 Vienna's Burgtheater, first German language state theater to restrict to spoken drama. Okay. Considering that Romanticism is going to be the high point of at least the beginning of the 18th century, its tenets were the understanding of spiritual truths and their importance over the physical being. So it's really about, you know, what should be like as opposed to the physical existence we live in. And there were a number of different writers in this time, and we'll talk about them when we get there. Two of the most important ones being Schlegel and Tieck, August Wilhelm Schlegel and Ludwig Tieck. And we're going to talk about them in a little bit. Although actually many people consider Goethe's Faust to be one of the high points of romantic drama, although he didn't connect with them. There also is this sort of aspect in there where within the Romantic movement, another movement comes in during that same time, sort of within it, called Young Germany. And they're rebelling against that sort of rosy-colored look at the world. And they're like, no, we want to look at the social problems and we want to fix these things. So Young Germany movement began, and two of the major writers for that were Friedrich Hebel and Jod Büchner. They'll also be on your dramatist list there. So dominance was difficult for really any major theater company at this point in time. Again, economically depressed, it's a very difficult time. But there were two that were majorly important at this particular point in time. And that was Berlin's National Theater and Vienna's Burgtheater. And that's where we are on your list there, right there, 1810, Vienna's Burgtheater. The Burgtheater is important because it was the first German language state theater that restricted its repertoire to just spoken drama. So it didn't do opera, didn't do operetta, didn't do any of that kind of stuff. It was just spoken drama. Yes, we're drinking Beck's because we're in Germany at the moment. So these theaters stood out, the National Theater and the Burgtheater, amongst all the other ones. In 1815, we see the German subsidies begin to start coming back after the French occupation is over. So during the time of the Napoleonic Wars, all the German subsidies for the theaters were cut, and they start to come back around 1815, right when he loses in Waterloo. Now see, once the subsidies come back and they're controlled by the state, government officials are employed as superintendents of these. So they had no real theatrical knowledge or skills. They just were appointed to oversee them. And they also dealt with severe censorship at that point in time as well. So theater thrived because it was being funded. It just kind of didn't grow at all. It didn't evolve. But the interesting thing that we have at this particular point in time is that we have some managers, theater managers. One by the name of Iflint, and you'll see him under I don't see him on there at all under your Iflint. All right, so under the National Theater companies, down there toward the bottom, National Theater Iflint. Okay, so Iflint is he was a successor, or he was a manager of the theater, his successor Karl Brewer, which you also see there, and a designer named Stubenwald were at the National Theater, and they started pushing for historical accuracy at a time where it really wasn't even thought about, and it started to become a little more common in German costumes and settings. Not really anywhere else, but that'll come later with other people. So it is because of that push to make it look more realistic that in 1826 we see the first fully developed box set in Germany. Not to say this hadn't been tried before, we talked about that already in in Italy a while back, but this was the first fully developed box set and attempted as some level of historical accuracy. Remember, we're not really necessarily at archaeological accuracy yet, because they didn't necessarily do the research right, but they were at least attempting to be a little more historically correct. Now, the interesting thing also is because these guys were going sort of down a new path, star actors start to become a standard. And see, the German public wasn't really attracted to the same old current repertory unless it had a star attached to it, unless a star's name was on it. And this is really helpful, actually. The next thing on your agenda is in 1835, the first railroad opens. Now, stars could play in different cities within days. It wouldn't take weeks to get somewhere. You could play in Berlin, and within a couple of days you could be in Munich or Dresden or anywhere else, right? So the railroad really opened up that capability for the star actor to really tour and do their work. So the sad thing of it is that Goethe and a guy by the name of Schroeder had really pushed for ensemble acting, and that ends up kind of beginning to wane once we start seeing the prevalence of the star actor, because they don't rehearse with the company. They're not part of the company. They come in for 2-3 days before the show, they rehearse a couple times with them, and then on they go. Matter of fact, it was also rather common for the star actor to come in and demand a good deal of the play to be cut, the other people's parts to be cut, so that it didn't detract from their own. Next thing we have is 1858 Offenbach's works are important. Offenbach is a German-born French composer, and he was mainly a composer of operetta, and so it started to become really, really popular. And their operetta really combined a lot of political and cultural satire, and they parody a lot of grand operas as well. So it's sort of an interesting mix there. Again, similar to the comic opera we've been talking about in France and so on and so forth. One of the greater writers of Germany in 1863, a guy by the name of Hebel, he passes away, and at that point, Friedrich Hebel, you'll see him on your list of dramatists there. At that point, the German language drama began to decline, and it really doesn't come bouncing back until around the 1890s, a little bit even further after that, when you start seeing some of Brecht's works being produced. So his work was sort of the high point of, after Goethe, high point of German language drama, and when he passed away, it was a devastating effect to German drama. 1875, we see the box set becomes customary for interior scenes and historical accuracy is accepted. Okay, like I said earlier, it had begun early and it slowly picks up speed, and now in Germany at least, very, very important for historical accuracy. Looking at the playwrights, on your list you see August Wilhelm Schlegel. He wrote plays that sort of formulated the theory of the Romanticism, and that was then followed throughout Europe. And we'll talk about also how that was disseminated in just a bit here. Then you have Ludwig Tieck. Ludwig Tieck is responsible for familiarizing Germany with the works of Shakespeare, refamiliarizing it, because they're familiar with it from, if you recall, in the 1650s, all the English troops coming over. Tieck goes to London, studies for a while, and was attempting to write this entire play compilation of Shakespeare's works and whatnot, and he never finished it, unfortunately. It's an unfinished work. But he brought back a lot of the interest of Shakespeare with him and did some Shakespeare's. And he kind of brought it back because he sort of considered Shakespeare to be the model on which Romantic plays were written. And he also published some plays, collected works of a different writer. It was a German writer, not really worthy of note specifically for our purposes, and but he will. It would not have been probably published or produced if it hadn't been for that. So the next one we have here is Heinrich von Kleist. Heinrich von Kleist was he's not really a Romantic writer, but roughly by the beginning of the 20th century, his reputation exceeds any Romantic writer they had at the time, and some of his plays actually are still in the German repertoire today. He's got some great works that are still very, very popular. Now, the next two are the Young Germany movement writers, Georg Büchner. And the interesting thing about Büchner is that his works were so advanced for his time. Now, considering he's writing roughly around the late 1820s, 1830s, people came across his works again in the early 1900s and thought they were modern works. So he was a little bit, his writing style was a bit ahead of his time. He's considered to be one of the major dramatists of the 19th century. If you've ever heard the play Danton's Death, that was one of his plays. The next person we have on there is Friedrich Hebel, also the Young Germany movement. We talked a little bit about him. The interesting thing with Hebel's works is they sort of embody this this struggle between old and new values, questioning the old. His most famous play is called Mary Magdalena, and is considered to be a forerunner to realism because its characters were drawn from everyday life. So we're kind of beginning to push that envelope towards realism, but it's just not here yet. That happens actually in France, where realism becomes discerned as a conscious movement. But the Germans are pushing it there with their realism for their setting and their historical accuracy, and now works like Hebel's works that start using regular people. Theater companies, the Bergtheater, run by Stubenrauch, and the National Theater by Ifflin. We talked about those already, so that's about pretty much what you need to know there. Now, producers, we have Ludwig Tieck, okay? Same as above, the guy that we just talked about. The other interesting thing about Tieck is that he sort of theorized a sort of return to the bare stage, like Shakespeare did it. He was brought in 1841 by William IV of Prussia to do a production, and he did Antigone, Sophocles' Antigone, and he built a skene and extended out the apron of the stage to do it just like they would have done it back then. It was wildly, fantastically received, and so then he continued this sort of concept with doing it the way it's supposed to be done on the stages they were written for, and that's why he started doing the bare stage with Shakespeare and started using Elizabethan conventions in his productions. He did A Midsummer Night's Dream in 1843 that was pretty much like they would have done it back then. And it was very popular in Germany. I think it ran some 40 times and traveled throughout Europe, or throughout Germany. And he was really groundbreaking in how he produced plays, but after he retired, everyone kind of went, that was fantastic, and let's go back to doing what we were doing, right? Except for a guy named Karl Immermann, who is your next guy. Karl Immermann, roughly about the same time as Tieck there, was doing the same kind of stuff. He was influenced by Goethe with the ensemble cast people, and was also influenced by what Tieck was doing. So he did a production of Twelfth Night that was like practically exactly as it would have been on stage then. So it was very, very popular again at that point, where he was, oh, it's done just like Shakespeare would have done it. Next we have Heinrich Laub. Heinrich Laub was a director of the Vienna Burgtheater in 1849 and held it till like 1867. The interesting thing about him was he pushed for the box set. He wasn't interested in these lavish, historically accurate sets. He was really more interested in the box set. And it's that reason that sort of pushed the box set into becoming a lot more of a staple on the German stage. Really far more interested in the actor, not the spectacle. So Laub was really sort of an actor training type person as far as getting that sort of level up to what we were already getting the rest of the production to. Franz Dinkelstedt is our next guy on the list there, and he was Laub's successor at the Burgtheater. So he started after Laub retired, and he did use the elaborate historical settings and all that kind of stuff. And he's mostly remembered for the fact that he did this Munich Industrial Exposition where he presented plays by Goethe, Schiller, and Lessing, G.E. Lessing, if you remember from our last session there, with some of Germany's finest actors. He's actually sort of the creator of theater festivals. The next theater festival he did was a presentation at the Burgtheater in 1875. He did a production of all of Shakespeare's histories, chronologically in order, one after the other, as just a big connected cycle. So that takes care of Germany for us. So let's move on to France. In 1789, we had the fall of the Bastille. Now, this is the French Revolution. All right, it's the end of the French Revolution because the Bastille falls. At the end of the French Revolution comes it's the beginning of the French Revolution. When the Bastille falls, that starts the revolution. Now comes the Reign of Terror. And the Reign of Terror, if you've ever heard of that before, that was after the Revolution, where you were probably going to be executed if anybody even whispered the fact that you were not sympathetic to the revolution. A lot of the actors were sympathetic, a lot of them weren't, so you had this 50-50 kind of split. 1791, all the theater monopolies are abolished, and the Comédie Française had its subsidies interrupted at that point in time, splits into two groups, those sympathizing with and those not sympathizing with it. The ones who sympathized with it joined actors from another group called Varietés Amusantes, and they formed the Théâtre de la République in 1792. So that is predominantly the new Comédie Française, but they have a new name and they're also connected with another group, the Varietés Amusantes. Now in 1793, the remaining actors of the Comédie Française are all imprisoned. So that left the door open, since there was no competition, for the Théâtre de la République to be the finest group in Paris. And the Comédie Italienne then is renamed Théâtre Favart. Dangerously weakened by another rival, it had the Théâtre Feydeau. And the opera really is just kind of surviving only because the city of Paris took it over. 1799, Napoleon comes to power and the Comédie Française is reunited with its old members and it becomes the Comédie Française again. And in 1801 it gets its subsidies reestablished, and the Théâtre Feydeau and Théâtre Favart are now united into one company, and that's called the Théâtre National de l'Opéra Comique. So they do comic opera predominantly. The Opera Comique was brought under state control in 1802 and got a subsidy in 1803. Now, in 1806, Napoleon, all of a sudden, I don't know why this little man is so interested in theater, specifically, when he's got all the rest of this world to conquer. But in 1806, he passed a decree that each company will have its own genre to do, and nobody will do anything from anyone else's genre. no new theaters could be opened, and all plays have to pass a censor. So he creates this, and then in 1807 he starts authorizing which ones can do what. So the Comédie Française gets comedy and tragedy. The Théâtre de l'Impératrice, which is a different group, it's later called the Odeon, does lesser dramas. The opera, of course, does grand opera, and the opera comique does the light opera and comic ballet. But then there's some sort of offshoot troupes that he also licenses, and they are the Théâtre de la Gaieté and the Ambigu Comique, and they do melodramas and pantomimes respectively. And then the Théâtre de Vérité and the Vaudeville, which do short plays, vaudevilles, skits, and comedies in vaudeville, if you recall that from your previous French. So these genre restrictions hang around until about 1831. All right, so that takes us like a way down here thus far, because I just kept rambling for no apparent reason there. 1822, that's round down here. It should be maybe on your Excel, it's line 31? Could be. It is on mine. So 1822, the opera introduces gas lighting. Okay. This wasn't installed in the Comédie Française until 1843, and it quickly began to dominate theater. But when they say they introduce gas lighting, they are doing that here, at least in the audience. So you've got gas lighting in the audience. You have oil lamp lighting on stage, candles. So you have open flame and gas. So now theaters don't just burn, they can explode. All right? So yeah, brilliant move, but nonetheless, that's what they did. Next thing on your list is riots over Hugo's Hernani. This is fantastic, all right? 1830, Victor Hugo, playwright, writes a play called Hernani. It is hailed by the Romanticists as the epic romantic play. This establishes Romanticism in France. That's where it begins, Victor Hugo's Hernani. The other half of the audience are the neoclassicists who don't like Romanticism. And they riot. And I don't mean riot as in they get up and they yell and they go boo and throw things at the, food at the person on stage. They riot. They pick up chairs. They beat the hell out of one another. People get severely injured over neoclassicism or Romanticism in theater. That's exciting theater, right? So Victor Hugo's riots there begin Romanticism in France. In 1831, the genre restrictions are removed from the theaters that Napoleon had put into place. Around 800 to 1830, melodrama flourishes in minor theaters. And melodrama is usually in exotic locations, very distinctive sort of stock characters, the evil guy, the good guy, and the damsel in distress, that kind of thing. So that's roughly what we're looking at in that regard as far as melodrama is concerned. It started with the minor theaters in France. It became really, really popular. Now, Romanticism was also then succeeded by another style of theater called theater of common sense. It was kind of a middle ground between the neoclassicists and the Romanticists, but very, very short-lived, 1830s. So after Romanticism, with the huge riots came in, somebody went, how about we write something that's kind of in the middle, makes everybody happy, right? And that was theater of common sense. It didn't have a big, huge following and wasn't extremely important in general for theater history. 1843, Victor Hugo's play Les Maigres. It was a complete flop, and everyone goes, "Oh my God, Romanticism! What were we thinking?" And the Romanticism just ends. There's that genre just sort of ends at that point. So, well done, Victor Hugo. Started and ended an entire genre in his country. Not too many people can put that on their resume. 1843, gaslighting is installed in the Comédie Française. You see that we just talked about that. Again, in the audience. 1848, operetta as a distinct form emerges. Now, we've had operetta, we've talked about it in the past, but this is now a distinct form in French drama. And it's a mixture of song, speech, fantasy, buffoonery, and usually sort of their subject matter is kind of irreverent and so it's a little dicey. But it's not as highbrow as opera or even opera comique. Okay, so you see the next one is around 1850 realism, a new style of theater. The reason for that is around 1850s, the working class rose up to demand reforms. There was revolutions, unwillingness of governments to change, and then with some scientific advancements that occurred around the middle of the 19th century, a lot of factors led to this new style called realism, looking at life as it is. And around 1850, they began to advocate, the critics of the time began to advocate a more close and objective view of life, and that's the basis behind realism. 1853, realism is first discernible as a conscious movement. So you start to see the germ of realism by 1853, and by 1863, it is now all the foundations have been literally expressed and laid out of what makes realism in theater. All right, so looking at dramatists, first we have Eugene Scribe. Eugene Scribe is most well known for the well-made play. And he's the well-made play formula usually deals with it doesn't have necessarily a set amount of acts, but it's usually good versus evil kind of thing. But there's always the protagonist or someone in there who comes up with some kind of a letter or message or something that completely gives them a different outlook on the situation that they're in. And it's a very predictable style of theater, and the climax to it is right near the end. The climactic action is right before the end of the play, and you also get the feeling that the protagonist actually will continue on thereafter. So this is the well-made play formula created by Eugene Scribe. Actually, it was sort of theorized by another writer, but Eugene Scribe sort of made it widely accepted. He wrote plays like A Scrap of Paper, A Glass of Water, things like that. Next we have Alexandre Dumas on that. You would probably know Dumas by the fact that he wrote Count of Monte Cristo, I believe it was, and also the Three Musketeers. But he was also a playwright, and actually in the 1840s he created, he built the Théâtre Historique. You don't know that, but there it is. But Alexandre Dumas used Scribe's well-made play model for a lot of his plays and wrote about social problems. Émile Augier he initially wrote for actually Theatre of Common Sense, oddly enough, for that short-lived time, but then switched to realism because that's what came and usurped it. He also wrote about class struggle, social problems. Then we have René Charles Gilbert de Picquelot, and that's quite a bit to say. The popularity of his works really were him establishing sort of what melodrama was as a dominant type in the 19th century. And this melodrama actually also paved the way for French romantic drama. It's not the other way around. Melodrama paves the way for French romantic drama. We have Madame de Staël. This is what I was talking about, how Romanticism actually kind of appears here. She was a daughter of Louis XVI's finance minister, if I remember correctly, and the wife of the Swedish ambassador to France. So she hated Napoleon. She actually even fled when he took over. She went to Germany. In Germany, she wrote a book called Of Germany, and she was introduced to Romanticism there. This was the foundations of Romanticism. But because of the strife between her and Napoleon, it was banned immediately in France, and it did not come back out until Napoleon's reign was over. That's why you see Romanticism start to take hold after 1815 when Napoleon was exiled. Victor Hugo, we just talked about. The one in 1830 riots, Romanticism there, 1843, my play sucks, Romanticism's dead. That's in a nutshell for you, but that's the guy. And then we have François Poncet. And another theater of common sense playwright, he brought the theater of common sense sort of out to the open to the people, sort of made it public with his play Le Cuisse. We have producers and designers as the next thing on here. So we have, first of all, Adolphe Montigny. All right, and Adolphe Montigny is he actually sort of brought realism into directing, early director, because directors really kind of don't still yet exist. They're trying, they're starting to become a force, but they're not big yet. And he insisted on realistic movement and speech patterns from his actors. Wow, oddly enough. And the realistic movement was evident in his scenery and costuming. So he was the first person to kind of start to say, you know what, it actually should look like we're looking at people living their daily lives on stage. He's one of the first people to do that. Actors are still being taught in service, but there's a large push at this point in time towards conservatory, towards actor training. Actually, a guy named Francois Dessart wrote a book on, which is basically the first method of acting. It's pretty crazy, and it's nowhere near what we would consider realistic acting, but that's what it was at that time. That's what they had at that time, the Dessart method. And it was also the first step to, Montigny was one of the first people to sort of push toward the star performer. So that's where sort of the star performer began in France, was with Montigny's work. Then we have Louis-Jacques Daguerre. It is misspelled on your notes there. It should be 1G, just to let you know. And Louis-Jacques Daguerre was a designer, and he's credited with creating the panorama. And the panorama, basically, if you can imagine two cylinders that have a bolt of canvas between them with a painting on it, and then you roll them like this, and all of a sudden the scenery starts to move by. That's the panorama which he created. It's very similar to the one that we talked about with in the Greek theater, sort of that cycloron on the back there, right? And by the way, just to let you know, Daguerre is also the inventor of the daguerreotype, one of the first camera. More information you'll never need to know in your life, but there it is. He was principal designer for the Ambigu Comique from 1816 to 1822. And then he left the stage. Why? Because he invented the daguerreotype, and that made a lot of money. Next one we have is Pierre-Charles Cicéret, and he was one of the most successful designers of the period. Actually, he was so in demand that he created a school for designers because he couldn't keep up with the work. So he basically built a school to train people to design like him, and that was the first school of designers. And his students would dominate French design for the rest of the century. All right. Looking at Russia, and then we're going to end this, and we'll come back for a second session with America, or England and America. So, looking at Russia here, a number of changes occurred in Russia, mainly due to Prince Alexander Tchaikovsky. He's the director of the repertory in the Imperial Theater from 1801 to 1826. So Tchaikovsky brings some reforms. But there's a man by the name of Charles Didelot. He was a Frenchman, and he brought some reforms in ballet to Russia in 1801 to 1829. And it is going to be the spark of Russian ballet. More will come a little bit later by a man named Petipa. We'll talk about him in a second. 1805, State Theater is opened in St. Petersburg. And keep in mind also that St. Petersburg, not Moscow, is the capital. In 1809, a training school is added to this, and Tchaikovsky was one of the people that sort of got that pushing. He visited Paris and some other Western European theaters, and all of a sudden started coming back with various different regulations on governing troops. And he wanted to raise the level of production to sort of compete with the rest of culture in Europe, right? And that's what he did. And these things that he did, these changes, reforms that he made, were to remain in effect from 1825 to 1917. I have to double check because in 1805 the State Theater, I think it might have actually opened in Moscow, not in St. Petersburg. I'll have to double check it. But it's not to worry. That's not going to be one of the things that's on your exam, so I wouldn't sweat it. 1822. Now this is a really interesting thing here. Alexander Griboyev writes "Woe from Wit." Now this is the epitome of neoclassical theater, in writing at least, dramatic writing, in Russia. But you don't see it for practically another 50 years, just about 48 maybe. So, all right, what happens here is this. Nicholas I becomes Tsar of Russia in 1825, and he does it after the Decembrist Revolution, where the army attacked as soon as he was called Tsar, and he had to quell that revolution. Because of this, and the unfair treatment of the serfs and all this kind of stuff, there's an open rebellion. He comes in, first day of becoming Tsar, he deals with a rebellion, and he quells it. So he defeats the rebellion, and then he creates a secret police force, sort of the forerunners to the KGB. It's not the KGB, but it's the forerunners to them. And censorship just rises to its highest level. So this guy, Alexander Griboyev, writes a play called Woe from Wit. It's not seen for about 47 years. So, whereas it typically has gone neoclassicism, romanticism, realism in most other countries, it goes neoclassicism, but we don't know about it. Romanticism, realism, oh, neoclassicism, but we're not going to stay, right? It's kind of strange, but that's what censorship does in Russia. So his play isn't even seen till 1869. So that'll give you an idea. Woe from Wit, not seen on stage till 1869. But around the 1820s, the Romantic style emerges, roughly like it is everywhere else in Europe. And that emerges with a writer by the name of Alexander Pushkin, who writes Boris Godunov. And that play kicks in the Romantic era. Somewhere around the 1830s, a more realistic style began. Not necessarily full-blown realism, because what we just said, that appeared in France. But it's a little more realistic style. Is brought in through works of a guy by the name of Nikolai Gogol. He wrote The Inspector General. And that sort of prompted writers to move toward a more realistic style. It won't become completely to the fore till after 1850, just like everywhere else. Sets in Russia at this time are still pretty much wing and drop. The box set, seen in the 30s, doesn't become popular until later in that century. Alright, so 1862, the Russian Musical Society opens a conservatory in St. Petersburg. Okay, most actors up to this time are trained in service, but now or state-sponsored schools, which we've talked about in the last time we talked about Russia. Now, actually, it's a private conservatory meant to train actors. 1882, theatrical monopolies held by Moscow and St. Petersburg are abolished. All right, the public theater starts to expand at this point in time because now it can. Now they don't have monopolies to deal with. A guy by the name of O.A. Korsh, K-O-R-S-H, you should see him, I think. Yep, right there in 1882. He founded an acting troupe in 1882, wanted to push the level of production, and he did very well. They introduced a number of significant plays from the Western world, and they also established matinee performances in Russia, which is something even the rest of the West is not necessarily doing. The England will start, and we'll talk about that when we get to England. By the 1890s, the company began to lose its prestige, and its standard of production was kind of waning. So along comes another guy by the name of Stanislavski with his best friend Vladimir Emirovich Denchenko, and they sit in a coffee shop for like some 18 hours and talk about theater and what it should be. And out of that is born the Moscow Art Theater. We'll talk about that when we get into modern theater because that's where it actually belongs. Alright, so as far as dramatists are concerned, we talked about Alexander Griboyev, Alexander Pushkin, Nikolai Gogol. So let's talk about Ivan Turgenev. Ivan Turgenev is when realism and drama was first fully realized in Russia through his works. He used domestic detail to reveal this sort of inner turmoil. It was basically on his works that Chekhov based his stuff. So if you're familiar with Chekhov's works, you kind of know now what you're looking at with Turgenev's works. He wrote a play called like A Month in the Country, which is one of his more well-known ones. Again, written in 1850, produced like 1872. So again, it takes a while sometimes in censored places. The next guy is Alexander Ostrovsky. Ostrovsky is he sort of popularized realism, and they were written after Turgenev's, but they were produced earlier. So oddly enough, he is, I guess you would sort of consider him sort of like the beginning of the national drama in Russia, because he was the first person to write Russian dramas sort of free of any sort of Western influence at all. They were all very based on Russian history and culture. Also instrumental in founding the Russian Society of Dramatic Authors and Composers in 1866. So that gives you a bit of an idea of who Alexander Ostrovsky is. Then we have producers and directors here. Alexander Tchaikovsky, director of the repertory in the Imperial Theaters, 1801 to 1826. He traveled around Europe, I started seeing what other countries do, brought it back, and that's what started pushing the level of Russian performance a lot higher, and also brought things such as actor conservatories. Marius Petipa. Marius Petipa was the person he was appointed the ballet master of the Imperial Schools in 1862, and he was the man who brought Russian ballet to the level it is today. He brought it to the level that Russia is known for it, and it has continued on from that point. So that's why it is so prized around the world today. Russian ballet is because of Marius Petipa. And you have O.A. Korush, who we just talked about already, and that ends Russia. So the next thing we'll be doing is America and England.